This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Developers, are you ready? It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. When you can make faster decisions, there's no telling what you'll create. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Aaron Vonderhaar is a software developer at No-Red Inc. and a core team member of the Elm programming language. As part of Elm, Aaron is the author and maintainer of Elm Format, as well as the maintainer of Elm Test. Aaron also hosts the Elm Live videocast, where he shares his knowledge and educates developers about best practices in Elm. Prior to No-Red Inc., Aaron was a developer and manager at Pivotal Labs, building full-stack web and mobile applications for a variety of clients. Aaron, thanks for coming on Software Engineering Radio.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm very fascinated by the Elm programming language. It feels like Haskell, and yet it's done on sort of the front end in the web browser. So I'd love it if you could just give me sort of a basic introduction to the language and how you got involved.
Yeah, for sure. I think Elm is kind of known frequently as talked about as a functional language. I think we'll touch on some of the details of that later. But kind of the mission for Elm and what attracted me to it in the first place when I started going to some of the Elm meetups in San Francisco, something like 5 years ago, was that Evan Czaplicki, the author of Elm, is really focused on kind of the usability of Elm as a language, and specifically has been trying to design it targeting web app developers in a way that brings the power of functional programming language and a lot of programming language research to web developers in a way that is kind of focused on how web developers would want to use a programming language.
Elm is a programming language, and it's also known as a framework. Can you tell us a bit about just the distinctions between the two?
Yeah, sure. So certainly Elm is a language in that there's a particular syntax for the files and a particular way you write, for instance, lists and expressions and operators and all that. As a framework, Elm also defines, I guess, what's commonly called the Elm architecture, which is a particular way of architecting a web app. And what's interesting about Elm is that that particular architecture for web apps is essentially a core part of the language. A lot of language features and features of the compiler are built around that web app architecture, which enables a lot of kind of niceties of the language that are targeted at web app developers, where a more general purpose language might not have the ability to really optimize the user experience for a particular type of developer. So Elm kind of being both a language and a framework specifically for web app development really helps simplify the language itself and make it a lot nicer to use than other languages that are maybe trying to do a lot more things.
And from my experience using Elm, it's been nice to be able to have both of those things together packaged into one usable framework, combining the two. My sort of introductory question into all this, though, is it is 2020. Why do we need a new language? What problem is Elm trying to solve?
Sure. Well, first of all, Elm isn't an especially new language. It's starting to become more popular, but it has been around for quite a while. I've been using it for 5 years. It's been around longer than that. So it's kind of, should I say this, like solving any complicated problem particularly well takes a while for something new to come on the scene and to mature over time. I think the sweet spot for Elm, I think, is that compared to a lot of other options for web app development at the time or currently, Elm is very focused on keeping things simple and kind of zeroing in on providing just the power and flexibility that is useful for web app development without doing a lot of extra unnecessary stuff. For instance, a lot of JavaScript frameworks are limited by what's available in the language of JavaScript itself. Not that that's necessarily a limitation, but Elm being a language allows it to make choices that give it more flexibility in what the developer experience is like than other things that just build on top of JavaScript.
And you mentioned that the language has been in development for quite a while. I actually got really interested in it from the very beginning. I read Evan's paper on asynchronous functional reactive programming for GUIs back at Harvard. We're going to link to that paper in the show notes for the episode. But I'd love to just I'd love to understand more about each of those pieces. There's a lot of adjectives about that paper, which is usually the case for academic papers. And just breaking some of those things down, it would be great for you to just give me an introduction on a few of these concepts. So functional programming, reactive programming. I would just love an introduction to both of these if you could provide some color to them.
Yeah, sure. And I'll add that I kind of got introduced to all this at one of Evan's Strange Loop talks, which hopefully we can add the link to in the show notes. But yeah, functional programming, that can be kind of a nebulous term, but it tends to refer to languages that use immutable data structures, that have pure functions, and also that can try to restrict and have a sophisticated type system that can kind of represent and or allow you to limit when you do risky actions like do disk IO or something like that. Reactive programming is actually a concept that Elm has kind of moved away from in more recent versions. Reactive programming is kind of this idea where you define data sources, which is perhaps like, you can think of it as like a stream of values over time. So say you have some entity that represents a person's name, and if that ever changes, you'll kind of get a new event propagated through the system based on that. So reactive programming is kind of this programming model where you build up essentially a graph of how you compute the final value. For instance, how you compute the page that your user sees based on a bunch of inputs. And a reactive programming language would kind of manage updating everything as the input values change and recomputing only what's needed to recompute the output.
Interesting. So I actually do remember seeing one of the releases mentioning in the release notes that you were moving away from reactive programming. What spawned that change, and what is sort of replacing it or making it better in the newer versions of Elm?
Yeah, so the reactive model and this idea of signals was the data type that represented it in older versions of Elm. The signals were around up through, I think, Elm version 0.16. And my understanding of what Evan was seeing is just that it was a very complicated and unfamiliar way to think about modeling your web app, to have to think in that reactive programming kind of style. So what's now talked about as the Elm architecture was basically the new thing that replaced the reactive programming aspects of Elm. And yeah, I mean, I'm pretty convinced as well, and I've seen a lot of people who've been trying to teach Elm over the years say that this new model, the Elm architecture, is a much simpler thing to be able to visualize and understand, and a better way to think about what your web app is doing than the functional reactive style that Elm did in the past.
You and Evan worked together at No Red Ink, correct?
Yep.
And so is that how you adopted Elm at No Red Ink? Did he just introduce it, or how did it get involved in your production environments?
Yeah. So that actually predates me at No Red Ink, but it also predates Evan at No Red Ink. Richard Feldman, who is one of the probably most well-known speaker on Elm topics, was one of the earliest developers at No Red Ink, and he started adopting Elm. The way that worked was, No Red Ink is an education company. We have a site where teachers can create grammar and writing assignments and assign those to students. So the way Richard went about having No Red Ink experiment with Elm and then eventually adopt it was to take one of the most complicated pages of our site where we had a ton of bugs and frequent regressions, which was the assignment form, where teachers can create new assignments, select from the hundreds of topics we have, and assign them to to classes and to students within classes. So NoRed Inc.'s first use of Elm was to take just the business logic and validation logic for that assignment form page and re-implement that logic in Elm. And we still had a React site that just called out to the compiled business logic in the Elm code. And that ended up being super successful. It kind of quelled the flow of bugs. And from there, it was kind of a long process over time, but it was several years ago that we kind of finished converting almost all of our site to Elm. And basically all of our new front-end development is all done in Elm.
Wow. So do you guys have a sense of what the before and after was like? You know, from my experience in introducing these things in production, usually you sort of do these things on a much lower risk part of your application because it's a brand new language. So it's exciting that he was willing to take that risk on something that was clearly very important to the business. And it'd be even cooler to see, do you know if there were any metrics as to, bug rates plummeted or code readability increased? Do you have any sort of case study metrics on that initial case?
Yeah, well, I believe the main indicator was kind of just the number of times day to day during a month that unexpected bugs would come up. It's more of an informal metric. At the time that experiment was happening, all of NoRed Inc. was about 20 people, so a very small company. And I think there were maybe 4 or 5 engineers at the time. So most of our growth, now NoRed Inc. is 100 people and 30 engineers. And most of our growth has been after the adoption of Elm. And I mean, from that aspect, it has not been a problem. And probably we could attribute a lot of productivity and relatively low number of critical production bugs on the front end. I mean, I can't really think of any that come to mind. But yeah, having the size of company we have now and the number of features that we've built over the last 4 years, I would be definitely confident in recommending Elm as a front end platform for a company.
And you said the entire front end is now almost completely written in Elm. So I'm guessing what happened was the bug counts dropped and they said, great, this sounds like a good company risk to take. We should start to adopt Elm in more pieces of the code base.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I think also we, NoRed Inc. at the time, we were using Elm as kind of an attractive selling point for hiring engineers and looking for a particular type of engineer who's interested in the type of technical excellence that functional programming is sometimes associated with. And I think that's still the case today, although we haven't been hiring as aggressively as we used to. But kind of using a fringe or a more fringe language that is exciting and interesting to people was also, I think, part of the reason we were able to attract a lot of the great engineers that we have today.
Right, and I'm sure it's a trade-off just like anything else. On the one hand, you've got these people who are more interested in these fringe languages or an alternative way of developing with more of a craftsman mindset in mind, which is great. Of course, the turnoff is that it is a more difficult practice to adopt right out the gate, so you're not necessarily going to get as many people applying. But it's almost like the right signal you're looking for, which is we don't necessarily want everyone applying. We want people who understand good programming practices and want to build that craftsmanship into their code from day one. And Elm allows you to do that. So in actually diving into those specific pieces of Elm, we know that it supports strings, numbers, lists, arrays, etc., all the basics you would expect out of a language. Is there anything common that's either missing or present that we take for granted that we should know about with Elm?
Sure. One of the biggest things would be union types, or now in the Elm documentation, we call them custom types, which is, this was talked about on a past episode with the author of the DAL language as well. Union types are kind of like enums in a sense, where you can list out different options that can be represented by a particular type, but they also go beyond enums in that each possible option is capable of having additional pieces of data that are specific to that option. For instance, we might have a custom type that represents a user on our site, and that user can either be a teacher or a student or an administrator. And if the user is a teacher, they're going to have potentially a premium license ID. And if they're a student, they won't have that piece of information. So custom types allow you to kind of define those enumerations, but also have type safety around knowing exactly what pieces of data are available for each option and which aren't.
Got it. So it's more than just subclassing. It's saying for each of these different configurations, there might be different ways that the objects are constructed.
Yep, exactly. And one of the things the Elm compiler will do is make sure that every time you want to do something with that kind of object or value, as we say in Elm, that you have to handle each option. And if you ever have an unhandled option, it's going to be a compile time error in Elm. So that's one of the many ways that Elm helps prevent errors at runtime.
When people are first starting to write their first lines of code in Elm, what are they expecting that they don't end up seeing, coming from, say, an OOP background?
I guess especially if Elm is your first functional programming language, probably the most unusual thing about it would be the use of immutable data. So that means, for instance, if you have some record of fields that represent some information and you want to update one of those fields, in JavaScript, you'd basically just replace that field with a new value. In Elm, because it's a pure language, is basically what pure functions mean, you aren't able to manipulate records that already exist. You have to think about creating new records that represent the new data that you wanted to have. So in the case of a user where you're updating their name, you'd be returning an entire new user record with the name having a new value and everything else being the same. I think that concept is one of the most unusual. You have to think a bit differently about how to write your functions that manipulate data. But yeah, that's something that's kind of specific to functional programming languages. So I guess if you're coming from JavaScript, unless you've been really focused on writing JavaScript in a functional style, that's probably going to be one of the biggest new things to get familiar with.
That makes sense too. The best example I could give to JavaScript developers that's already part of the native language would be push versus concat. So for example, if you're pushing an object into an array, what that's going to do is it's going to add on a value to that existing array object, and you're manipulating it in that exact address space. Whereas concat is going to look like it does the exact same thing because the return result will be the same, but the difference is it's now allocated to a different piece of memory. So it's almost like you're creating snapshots in a window into previous versions of a variable when you're doing it immutably. Whereas when you can mutate something, you're changing that exact address space. So the way I like to describe it is that, yes, immutability doesn't mean that you can't have a window into modifying things. It just means that that modification manifests in new stack space that you can allocate for a new variable. It just gives you that flexibility. So you can, in a way, it's actually more flexible because you can look back at the previous snapshots without modifying any of those changes along the way. So it's almost like if you had a debugger and you're looking at how does this thing evolve over time, it's a lot easier to make that case when you use immutable objects instead of mutable ones.
Yep, exactly. That's definitely one of the benefits. Where that tends to manifest day to day is that you kind of have to get familiar with more of a recursion style of iterating over things. So kind of as an implication of this, Elm doesn't have constructs like for loops and while loops. Instead, you have to use recursion, although day to day you tend to not use a lot of recursion directly, but there's kind of a group of APIs that in Elm are in a much more, are in an API style that is built on recursiveness rather than on loops. So for example, in Elm you have list.map for transforming lists and list.fold, which a lot of people know as reduce for kind of processing lists. So because those are kind of the only options available in a pure functional language, day to day you have to get familiar with those kind of APIs rather than what you're maybe used to, which that's kind of an implication of this immutable versus mutable difference.
Recursion and immutability are definitely foundations of functional programming. Another big one is state, and trying to move away from stateless work. Can you describe more about how statelessness is important in functional programming in Elm?
Sure. So the benefits you get from statelessness and using only pure functions is that if you know the inputs to a particular function, you always know what the output will be. So this really helps in defining reproducible test cases and automated tests. It also can really help speed up the debugging process when you're trying to debug something that's not working as expected. You can basically have 100% certainty if you've ruled out one area of the code. There's no unexpected way that something can be happening there that you didn't think about, like in the case of Ruby, where maybe some method was dynamically changed that you didn't realize and it's affecting your system. So those are the benefits. I mean, certainly in a web app, there is some kind of state in actuality, like the user is going to be interacting with your page and things are going to happen as a result of that. Basically, the way it works in Elm, which is also different from a lot of other functional languages, this is kind of where we get back to Elm as a framework. So Elm as a framework defines the Elm architecture, where basically the Elm core library is managing the state for you, and you provide some functions that specify how the state will update in response to particular events happening in your page. So basically, for your Elm program, you're defining a data type. We call it your model, which represents the current state of your program. And then you're going to define a function called the update function, which takes in an event and the current state of the application and returns the new state of the application that should be the result of processing that event. And then Elm itself is what takes those two things and wires them together and manages updating the DOM in response to changes and doing the DOM updates efficiently and managing all that for you.
I'm glad you spoke on the state piece, because for many functional languages, whether it's Clojure or in Haskell in particular, even to worry about state, you have to import a particular I/O package just to deal with something that in many cases these languages try to avoid as much as possible. But at least you understand that you are working in the web and there are some unavoidable states that you have to manage. So the fact that Elm embraces that and understands that, look, you want to avoid state whenever possible, but it's inevitable, so here's how to handle it via the architecture. I think that's super important for the strength of the language. The other thing you touched on earlier, which I wanted to come back to, was about types. You had mentioned that there was, I think it was called custom types or custom sets that describe the custom types that describe sort of the enumerations plus additional object validations. In talking about types in a typed language, especially in the front end, we often think of TypeScript or Flow. It seems pretty obvious to me that because this is built into the language, it's stronger than both of them. Can you tell me more about how types are more rigorous in Elm versus sort of a layer on top framework like TypeScript or Flow?
Sure. So TypeScript, I always get TypeScript and PureScript confused. PureScript has a very sophisticated type system.
That must be a great place to be in, by the way, where you are so entrenched in the Elm world that you don't have to worry about things like TypeScript.
Right. Yeah, so I guess the main thing for me about the types in Elm is that they're a core part of the language design, but specifically a core part of the language syntax. And that's particularly nice because it means that the syntax can be very simple. And I think Evan's done a great job of focusing on trying to keep the syntax of the language as simple as possible without a bunch of unnecessary symbols or nesting or weird words that you don't know what they mean. So specifically compared to some type of typing system where you're basically annotating an existing language with some new special syntax that has to fit in with the original language, Elm has the benefit of being able to have a much cleaner and much simpler and straightforward syntax for expressing type annotations. On top of that, I'm not super familiar with the details of the type system for either Flow or TypeScript, but Elm has a very complete and robust handling of types, and in particular, you can do things like generics, maybe that's only a term familiar to Java developers, but being able to have type annotations where you have type variables in them and have that provide type safety basically as deep as you need it is one of the specific nice parts of the Elm language. I don't actually know how much of those features are available in some of the other options. But
Yeah, the variable piece is supported in TypeScript for sure, but I think the key piece you're reflecting on, which is important, is that because you're starting from first principles with a basic language that's essentially made from scratch, the type system in general has a very simple grammar in Elm because it's built to be as simple as possible. I guess one of the things I was curious about was, in addition to that, is there a plugin or library for types for, say, the HTML DOM or the JS DOM? So for example, I know one of the things you can do in Elm is JavaScript interop. So is there a whole type system for the types in JavaScript? Or can I interact with a HTML input element, for example, in Elm in terms of a type?
yeah, so the DOM is not directly interacted with, but in the case of working with data that you're passing back and forth between JavaScript, basically there is no difference between what you're doing in your normal Elm code. So when you interact with JavaScript, you use this feature called ports. There's like one or two keywords in the Elm syntax that let you define those. And you basically use a normal Elm type to specify the type of data that is going to go through that port. And there's a pretty basic mapping of how different Elm types map to JavaScript types. And that's just done automatically. There are certain cases where you may want something more complicated in JavaScript and be able to define how that maps to an Elm type. So as a fallback, you can always use this type called json.value, which is an Elm type, but it's associated with an API that lets you essentially define decoders, which specifies how an arbitrary piece of JSON will map to an Elm type and vice versa.
All right, so you have built in basically a JSON parser as well as, I mean, are ports something like eval, where you're essentially running JavaScript inside of a Elm program?
Nope, it's isolated to be safe, and ports are basically more of a RPC mechanism, I guess. Basically, there's two types of ports. There's the incoming ports and outgoing ports, and in both cases, the port will have a name and it'll have a data type that it can send. So on the Elm side, you will produce these representations of effects. Basically, you can provide Elm a command, we call them, or a subscription, and it basically tells the Elm runtime that it needs to send a particular value out or expect a certain value to come in. And then on the JavaScript side, you basically, when you start your Elm application, you get a handle to the ports, and you can say, okay, for this particular port, I want to subscribe to any events coming out of Elm, and here's the callback function to use. And to go the other way on the JavaScript side, you just say, okay, I want to send this value to the port with this name.
Okay, so if I wanted to do a data visualization and I wanted to interact with D3, is the most common way of interacting with something like D3 to use a port in order to interop between the two services? Or what sort of, let's say I'm a game developer. How would I want to handle Canvas development?
Yeah, so I think potentially for Canvas and certainly for WebGL, there actually is, there are some Elm libraries that wrap those. And they're kind of special libraries because they have internal access to do things in JavaScript on your behalf. So a few of the core Elm libraries are capable of doing more sophisticated integrations with JavaScript. But if you're not using one of those things, if there's some JavaScript SDK that you want to interoperate with, then basically you need to define what kind of values need to get sent to that API, JavaScript API, and what types of values will come out of it. You define Elm data types for those, and then you just provide your handlers. Basically, when Elm produces a value, of this type. What should the JavaScript world do with that? So yeah, that's certainly the most common for unusual stuff. In the case of D3 specifically, it tends to have a very large API and very sophisticated. So typically, if you were integrating your own LMAP with D3, you would be doing something where you'd kind of be defining your own API of exactly what your LMAP wants to do with D3, and kind of implementing a JavaScript API that uses D3 to do what it wants. You'd probably do something like that as opposed to making a generic D3 wrapper that exposes the entire D3 API to Elm.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, taking a step back, I sort of baited with a very complex case with a sort of integration with a third-party library that's very robust. If we took a step back to something way more simple, let's say you're building a CRUD app. What kinds of things are built into the Elm architecture that we can get right out of the box? So for example, when I think of a web app, I'm thinking of routing, query string manipulation, JSON parsing. Just sort of run through for me sort of the basics that you get out of the box with Elm when you're building a basic web app.
Sure. So kind of the first entry point is when your Elm app starts, you can provide it some JSON data if you want to. You can also easily integrate with HTTP requests, both making them and then being able to parse JSON data that comes back through those. That's particularly easy. As far as single page apps and like handling multiple URLs within the same Elm application, that can be done. There's some built-in hooks basically when you define your Elm program of how you're going to update the internal state of your application when one of those URL change events happens. It's not super high level, so basically you kind of will have to define your own logic of how you're handling routing and things like that. But there is a URL parser library, for instance, that makes it easier to parse routes, but you'll still have to define the logic of how you're handling routing and so forth.
I didn't realize when I asked that I wasn't specifying it was an SPA. So I'm curious, is Elm meant to be run as an SPA, or can you run it as more of a server-side programming language?
It can be both. Well, so Elm is only for the front end. You can use it now, and it's kind of a new feature, I think, in Elm 0.18 to be able to use it for building SPAs, but you don't have to. I think like 90% of NoRedInk's code is not SPAs, and we've been able to adopt that in certain cases where it makes sense, and it's been a bit of extra work to set up. So I'd say Elm's primary use case still is not single page apps, meaning only one app per URL, but it does have features to support single page apps if you want to get more advanced and build that kind of stuff.
Calling all developers. There's no telling what you can create when you upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Are you ready to build the applications you want, however you want them? Are you ready to develop applications faster than ever? Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
And in terms of interacting with HTTP and JSON the Elm way, it sounds like instead of this more SPA routing, that you've got something called subscriptions. Could you tell me more about those?
Sure. So kind of when you're thinking about how your Elm app interacts with the rest of the world, whether that's through HTTP requests or through, let's see, what's another good example? Through, I guess, browser events that can happen. There's kind of this boundary between Elm and the rest of the world. So there's two directions, and this basically parallels what we were talking about with ports. You can have incoming information or events, and you can have outgoing events or actions. So the names for those in Elm, when you want Elm to trigger something external to happen, those are called commands. And when you want to tell Elm that you want to be notified when particular things happen, those are called subscriptions. So in the case of subscriptions, you don't normally need those for HTTP requests unless you want to, for instance, monitor the download progress, like the percentage of a request that's in flight. Typically for HTTP requests, you only need to use the outgoing, the command interactions in Elm, where basically you say, okay, make this HTTP request. When a response comes back, notify me about that. But that doesn't require subscriptions at all to do that.
Okay, so would that be the recommended way to handle the external world outside of Elm instead of sort of something like SPAs, or are there alternatives as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that question kind of goes beyond the scope of Elm. Elm can support basically either way you want to go with that. At No Red Ink, in the past, we used to have our Rails backend compute some data, kind of package it into the HTML that's sent to the front end, and then when Elm starts up, we would read some JSON out of the HTML page and provide that to Elm when it starts up. So that's a model that works. The model we've been switching more to at No Red Ink is to have the Elm page just load up with nothing, show a loading state, and then fire off an AJAX request via Elm's HTTP module to load data from various endpoints. And then when that comes back, then we finally display it. So that model works also. Pretty much any preferred model for your front end interacting with your back end is going to be supported with Elm.
Right. The take-home message being you can do whatever you want, and Elm can support it in whatever way it can. Shifting gears just a little bit in terms of other features that Elm supports, one of the things that I actually got really interested in with Elm was the fact that it handles errors really well. The error messages I saw for Elm errors are some of the most user-friendly and human-readable I've ever seen. How did you guys manage that? I'm really curious as to how you thought so carefully about all the error message handling in Elm.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much all Ben Evans' work, and something that he has been particularly interested in for most, if not all, of Elm's development. When I started getting into Elm about 5 years ago, that was one of the things that I would frequently see Evan trying to do at Elm meetups, was to get Elm in front of new users who had never seen it before, kind of give them the basic tutorial, and then let them play with it a bit and see what kind of issues they ran into, and look at when they ran into a problem, did the Elm compiler provide something that was useful and pointed them in the right direction? Or did it give them something confusing? Or did it tell them something that was actually sending them in the wrong direction? So it's basically been through a lot of user observations like that, and like continued iteration and focus on the error messages. I know in the Elm 0.19 release, a lot of the behind the scenes work that Evan was doing was focused specifically on the error messages and improving the parser in a way that allowed more information to be known about the error when it happened, so that it could provide a better and more helpful error message.
In other words, if you really care about a problem and you put in the effort, you can solve it. And so in Evan's case,
Yeah.
He put in a lot of effort to care about message handling and error handling, and used almost a lot of sort of developer experience UX to figure out what kinds of problems are they running into, how do they want to see these errors surface. And that was the part that I was most excited about, for sure.
Yeah, and I think I think it can be an easy pitfall as a technical person who's building a technical tool to think about only designing the language for cases where you have a file that has correct syntax and works correctly. So I think that's an important thing, and something that is a big reason behind a lot of Elm's success, I think, is that Evan has really taken the time to think about, okay, what is the experience when you're an Elm user and you don't yet know what you're doing?
Well, and at the end of the day, we're writing software for other humans to read. So if you provide educational material that actually speaks to humans, it's going to be so much easier for them to actually find their problems and remedy them themselves than if you give them something like Stack Overflow, XYZ did thing. That is a very sort of bland language, whereas it almost feels like when I read error messages in Elm, it's like it's a genie in a bottle, and it's told me something that I didn't even know was a problem, and it can provide suggestions for me, which was really fascinating. That it's almost like it could predict spelling errors or something like that.
Yep.
The way that most people figure out how they handle their errors in 2020 is they have the IDE do it for them, especially in JavaScript. With VS Code, development is so much easier because you sort of get real-time feedback right in your IDE. Is there an IDE for Elm, or can you integrate it with an existing IDE for that sort of real-time development?
Yeah, there are a handful of plugins for different editors. Specifically, the best one at the moment is the plugin for IntelliJ, which is written by Keith Lazuka. That one, I think, has the most real-time update and best integration, and has some cool autofix features as well. There is an in-progress language server that a handful of folks in the Elm community have all been contributing to, and that's ongoing. It's still in early stages, but that'll certainly help with support in a lot of editors. But yeah, pretty much every editor out there has at least a basic plugin for Elm, but in general, there's still a lot of room for improvement there.
I've actually never heard of a language server. What is that all about?
That, I don't know a ton about it, but it is a protocol, I believe, started by Microsoft for Visual Studio Code. And it's basically I guess it's like a REST protocol in some ways, where editors can talk to a language server for a particular language, like Elm or Ruby or Haskell. And it basically provides a way for a particular language to create essentially a backend for features like autocomplete, jump to definition, jump to documentation, features like that, in a way that each editor then won't have to implement that themselves for every language. Instead, they can just use this protocol, and the protocol for each language can be implemented separately.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like a centralized version of storing the entire syntax tree, so you can just sort of reference all the new language features. Do I have a rough idea of what that's like?
Yeah, I think so. And again, I am only vaguely aware of what's going on, but it seems like a lot of people are excited about it, and there's a lot of effort on improving the features for that.
Yeah, with all these exciting features in Elm, there's a couple of things that come to mind around sort of like the meta features that are across all languages, like performance and testing. So starting with performance, how does it compare to JavaScript?
Yeah, so, well, in one sense, Elm compiles to JavaScript. So you're kind of comparing this to, does compiled Elm for a particular use perform better than handwritten JavaScript code, or the code in whatever framework you're choosing? So there's a lot of things that Elm does for you that give performance benefits that you would not want to write by hand, but potentially could get from some other JavaScript library. For instance, we talked about managing the state of your application earlier. Basically, every time the state of your app changes, we have to re-render the view of the page. Elm internally manages comparing what has changed so it can find the minimal updates to the DOM that need to be made, because DOM updates are one of the slowest things that are going to happen in your web app. So that's kind of a very sophisticated algorithm that is not something you'd write yourself. So in a lot of cases, what you write in Elm is going to be faster than what you might write yourself, or very fast compared to other frameworks. There are several now benchmarks out there that compare Elm to different frameworks, and it's pretty much always at or near the top over the past several years. There's a couple fancier, more specialized JavaScript frameworks that have come out recently that can beat it in certain circumstances. But overall, at no red ink, we've never had performance concerns with Elm. And in most cases, you're not going to need more performance than it gives you. And there's a few tools you can use within Elm if you're having particular issues as well.
How do you do those performance comparisons when you think about Elm as a language versus a framework? You sort of mentioned both of those in there. The way you just described it, to me, it sounds like Elm can be compared similar to another compiled to JavaScript framework like Svelte as a language. But in terms of as an architecture or a framework, it sounds like it could also be compared to React or Vue. Yeah, so how are you doing those performance comparisons if you're sort of straddling both worlds there?
Yeah, I would say that most people who use Elm are going to use it as a framework. and actually use the Elm runtime to manage a state of a web page, which re-renders over time. You can conceivably use Elm for basically just JavaScript code. I guess, like I mentioned, when No-Red Ink was first investigating Elm, we used Elm not as a framework, but just as a language to produce some JavaScript code that we could call as functions. If you're looking at performance comparisons for that, I'd say it's basically going to be the same as JavaScript because it compiles pretty directly to JavaScript at the moment. There's certainly potential that in the future, the Elm compiler could become more sophisticated and do fancier optimizations. But at the moment, any Elm code that doesn't deal with actual web applications and is just functions is basically going to compile pretty straightforwardly into corresponding JavaScript.
Under the hood, you've got a lot of those optimizations that you mentioned earlier, but there's also a few sort of keywords that you've baked into the language that help increase performance. Some of the ones I looked at were like HTML lazy and HTML keyed. How do those help in increasing performance for the applications we're developing?
Yeah, both of those things are basically hints that you can provide to the Elm runtime so that when it goes to update the page based on the new state of your application, it can be smarter about how to do those updates. An example would be, say you're showing on the page a list of items. If one of those items moves, it's basically a very difficult problem for Elm to compare the old state of the page to the new state of the page and determine that a particular item moved from one position to another. So basically, in order to stay fast, the default virtual DOM algorithm is just going to look for some fairly basic manipulations that might have happened. So if you're writing an app where you're frequently moving items around in a large list, that's where you can use HTML keyed. And basically the key there means each item in the list, you're giving it an identifier so that the virtual DOM diffing algorithm can very quickly identify which items have changed, which ones have moved around, which ones have been deleted, and compute a more optimal DOM manipulation based on that. HTML lazy is similar in that it basically helps short circuit some checks in the diffing, where if you have kind of a large data structure that it otherwise would need to traverse all the way through to compare, you can use HTML lazy and it'll kind of just do some extra record keeping to check at a higher level in your data structure. It can more quickly short circuit and say, okay, I know nothing has changed under here, so I don't have to spend the time checking for other differences throughout that sub portion of the data structure.
Two-part question. First, are these best practices mentioned in the docs? And further question, if not in the docs, do the error messages provide warnings for these? And the reason, one of the things I'm thinking of is something like keyed is very similar to lists in React. Oftentimes they suggest that you should always have a key included for the mapped object to do exactly what Elm is doing. And there are warnings for this if you don't have a key for a mapped value. So I'm wondering if there's documentation on these best practices, or if the error handling actually takes care of this for you.
Yeah, so this is a situation where there wouldn't be an error at compile time. And I believe the current version of Elm doesn't really have any warnings. Those are something that I know Elm that Evan plans to look at in more detail in the future versions to start adding more warnings in if they make sense.
Makes sense.
I think the way someone would find out about these issues at the moment would probably be running into problems, seeing it slow, and then searching for information. We have, like, the Elm community has a discourse, we have a Slack channel, there's also Stack Overflow, of course. And basically, if you go to any of those places and search for Elm performance problems, you're going to basically hear, like, hey, have you looked at HTML keyed? Have you looked at HTML lazy? And there is documentation for those, but you have to know what names to look for at the moment to find that.
Since Elm was on the front end, does that mean you would recommend folks use the dev tools built into your browser to profile, or is there a profiling tool that you can add as a plugin for Elm?
Yeah, currently it would just be through your normal browser dev tools. The stack traces in Elm are a bit messy, but you can roughly tell which Elm functions are involved in what's happening. But yeah, currently you have to do that through the existing browser Elm tools, but that's always something that could improve in the future.
Moving away from performance, another big thing that people think about when choosing a language or choosing a framework is security. So how is Elm secure, and how does that compare to JavaScript or another framework?
Yeah, I guess, is there a particular type of security you're interested, or what comes to mind for you when you wonder about security for front-end apps?
Yeah, the two big ones I think about, well, for language design in particular, you think about buffer overflows or memory safety, which I would assume would be pretty well handled given it's a functional language. But then the other thing too is just in terms of security vulnerabilities. You've got all these plugins that are part of the Elm ecosystem. How are those handled, and can they quickly be addressed?
Yeah, so I'd say maybe the biggest security feature of Elm is in how it handles external packages that your project might depend on. So specifically for that, the published packages are basically limited to only pure functions. So any third-party library that's written in Elm that you want to include in your Elm app, it doesn't have the ability to trigger any kind of effects. Like, it can't make HTTP requests unless it has some function that gives you that request back to you, and then you would actually have to, in your application, tell Elm to actually make that request before it happened. So other packages are very limited in what they can do to trigger external events, kind of as the nature of Elm. Another thing potentially for security is that any published packages, Elm basically enforces semantic versioning. So if there's any changes to an API in a new version of a package, it is not going to break your app, because you are going to have to explicitly upgrade to the next major version. So you're not going to accidentally get breaking API changes in any of your dependencies.
Another feature that is paramount to any language is testing. And I know one of the packages you work on is Elm Test. Does Elm come with test suites, and in sort of the stack of Elm testing granularity? When we talk about unit tests or integration tests or end-to-end tests for GUIs, what role does Elm Test play in that sort of layer of the stack?
So Elm itself has kind of some basic awareness of the fact that tests exist and that most projects are going to have them. And so basically you can define in any Elm project what additional libraries are going to be used in your testing code that are not at all related to the production code for that project. Beyond that, there is an Elm package that provides the API for writing tests, and there's also the Elm Test command line tool that can run the tests. Those are the two things that I've been involved in quite a bit, though there's a lot of other people like Max Goldstein and Noah Hall and Richard Feldman, and a lot of other people more recently who have kind of as a community helped maintain those Elm testing tools.
And is Elm Test just covering unit tests, or is it covering integration end to end? Like, what can you write all of them with it?
Yeah. So there's kind of some groups of different things. So you can do most of those. So let's start with unit tests. That's probably the primary focus of the Elm Test API. On top of that, there's also, I guess we call it fuzz testing, but quick check or property testing are words that people might be familiar with for kind of exhaustively investigating an entire space of inputs and outputs to a particular function and checking invariance against a wide range of inputs. That's another type of testing that's supported by the Elm Test library. As for integration testing, I actually have a separate library called Elm Program Test, and its purpose is basically to simulate the Elm runtime and the Elm browser. And you can write tests in that for an Elm program that are similar to maybe like Selenium tests, where you can say, okay, start up the program, check that this text is on the page in the heading, click this button, simulate this HTTP request coming back with this JSON data, click this other button, select this item from the checkbox, make sure this is on the page. So that style of testing you can do with my package Elm program test. It builds on top of the Elm test library. And I'd say that's kind of the limit of the extent of types of tests. As far as end-to-end testing, there's nothing directly in Elm to do that with. And typically you'd want to exercise your backend server as well at the same time. So for that type of testing, you'd need some other tool to write end-to-end tests in.
I'm just curious, how did you get involved in this package in particular? And are there any other parts of the language that you're interested in?
Yeah, sure. So one of my previous jobs was at Pivotal Labs, which has a kind of very specific culture for doing pair programming all the time and doing test-driven development in a certain way. So there I was involved with actually several different test frameworks. The Jasmine test framework for JavaScript was one that I worked on a tiny bit while I was there. The Roboelectric framework for Android apps, I also did a lot of maintenance on. So I've kind of had a long history in being involved with test frameworks for various languages. So yeah, I guess my involvement in the testing for Elm basically stemmed from wanting to see more fully featured testing frameworks available because they just weren't there 5 years ago. And pretty much everything we've talked about relating to testing has all been done in the last 4 years or so.
Wow, so the language has really come quite a ways in the last only couple of years. What's the future for Elm? What are the next big features you all are trying to release?
So as far as the core of Elm itself, that is pretty much exclusively Evan's domain. He's setting the main roadmap and does almost all of the work on the core language. However, there are a couple people who've gotten involved recently doing things like optimization of the core libraries, a few optimizations on the compiler, improving some of the internal data structures like dictionaries and lists and things like that. As far as the community, the Elm Language Server project is a big one that's going on right now. Personally, I've been continuing to improve the Elm program test kind of integration testing package that I mentioned. And also I work on Elm Format, which is the source code formatting tool, but I'm looking at adding some features to that will allow people to write kind of more sophisticated tools that can manipulate Elm source code or generate Elm source code, things like that. So those kind of fancier tools, and hopefully we'll get some more people interested in improving a lot of the editor integrations and things like that.
With all these cool new features and just the language in general being very robust, I just have to be the skeptic. What are the downsides to Elm? When are there use cases when you should not use Elm?
Yeah. So one that comes to mind is if you are maybe coming from Haskell or something like that and are looking for an extremely powerful type system to use for front-end code, Elm is not really that. It is focused on more of a user-friendly web app mindset-oriented approach to functional programming. So if you're looking for a very fancy, sophisticated, like rank N type system, that sort of stuff, you'll probably want to look at something more like PureScript, for example. Let's see, beyond that, I guess one downside is the fact that in the JavaScript world and in the React world in particular, there's a lot of kind of very sophisticated UI components that exist as libraries that you can just pull into your app very easily. Elm doesn't have a ton of that. That's something that's still developing. So I'd say that would be a potential reason if there's a particular type of sophisticated UI that is available in some other framework that you want to make use of.
And then on the flip side, are there any particularly good use cases for starting Elm? What's the best way to get involved to get started with Elm?
Yeah, so elmlang.org is kind of the starting point. There's also guide.elmlang.org, which is the basic guidebook for how to get started. Kind of goes through all the concepts that you need to know to get going and how to set up a project. So if you're interested in learning, I would say that's definitely the place. And then also there's the community page on the Elm website that links to the discourse or the Slack if you're interested in having a more interactive experience and hear from people who are in a similar situation. Let's see. Oh yeah, as for adopting it, I would say if you're at an existing company, probably the biggest pitfall you'll have is how to integrate Elm with whatever build tools you currently have, be that Webpack or I don't even know all the different options that are popular at the moment. But once you get past that, I'd say it's pretty straightforward to get used to Elm. If you are looking, for example, at adopting a large framework like React, for instance, versus Elm, basically, I think of Elm as being kind of simple and straightforward to the point that even though it's a totally new language, you can basically pick it up and get productive in it faster than you can jump into some existing React project, get familiar with all the libraries and dependencies that it's using, and come up to speed on that. So yeah, I'd say Elm is a pretty good fit for almost all levels of web applications.
Great, and we'll link to the documentation as well as a link to your video list that you have on YouTube for Elm Live for people to get started with programming Elm and the Elm architecture. So with that said, is there anything else that you'd like to conclude with?
Yeah, I'd say the YouTube list you just mentioned was from a couple years ago, and it's something that's been on my mind this year to kind of start and redo some Twitch streaming on Elm and cover some interesting topics. So certainly, if anyone's interested in that kind of stuff, shoot me a tweet on Twitter, and I am thinking about getting that kind of stuff going with some new content this year.
Great, and we'll link to that playlist as well as your Twitter and Elm's Twitter and all the other documentation on our show notes. Aaron, thanks again for coming on Software Engineering Radio.
Cool, yeah, thanks so much for your time in putting this together.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language, choose your tools, choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.